Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. My co-host Alex Benesch is with me. He's in Germany. I'm in the United States. We're kind of giving an American and European perspective on who the West's enemies are, both internal, both foreign and domestic, looking at the West as a combined entity. And we've been doing analysis of the current crisis, the war in Ukraine, the difficulties around the world where Russia and especially China are invading Latin America, Canada, trying to surround the United States, how the various narratives falsify the actual strategic reality, where Russia is attempting to claim to be the underdog against American aggression and hegemony, that in Ukraine the Euromaidan revolution was a coup orchestrated by the CIA. All of this nonsense, which so many people believe and accept, is all swirling around, and it's caused a lot of confusion in people's minds. We have a reconfiguration, a remapping of the right and left, both in Europe and the United States, the emergence of the AfD party in Germany, the emergence of a second Trump administration with Elon Musk sort of riding lead horse in the advance, pushing in different directions. I don't know, unconsciously or strategically. Elon Musk this week tweeted a tremendous post about 100 million people killed by communism, and mentioned the Marxist professors, kind of alluded to them in the post. Absolutely astonishing that Musk, reaching out to the AfD and the European right in Europe, keeps mentioning communism. Communism. Well, that supposedly was overthrown in
Mm.
1992, 1991. How is what is going on? Is Musk unconsciously connecting the dots? Is there some kind of intelligence? Is there a counter strategy? What are we really seeing here? And so, Alex, you've got some thoughts, and you've been tracking this week. Why don't you tell us what you're thinking about all this as it's unfolding?
Well, I was assembling notes on demographic operations, especially Soviet demographic operations externally and internally. Now, the Soviets, they tried to not just dominate populations through blunt force and intimidation, but the communists also had this idea that you had to move populations around. You had to put people from here to over there where almost nobody was, and then they had to, or they thought they had to remove populations even based on ethnicity. It was kind of like we want to get rid of everybody who is associated with South Korea, for example. Lots of populations being moved around. There was, of course, the Holodomor in Ukraine. This was also a demographic operation, as I think everybody should understand. This was not just an oops, we locked down Ukraine many decades ago. We locked down Ukraine and some people starved. No, this was a deliberate operation to stunt the growth of Ukraine. So it was a calculation. So many millions of people were supposed to die. And it's really hard for a nation like Ukraine to recover from that. Now, some demographic experts have made similar analysis with other countries. Now, of course, there's the German example. Germany never really recovered from World War One and Two demographically in terms of its people, because it's really hard to do. And so obviously people means power. The Soviets really understood that, and you can tell how certain countries are now very powerful that have many people. There's like China and India, and when the Soviet Union was still officially a thing, the United States quite large. Now the European Union as a whole is, I think, over 500 million people. So there's power in numbers. As long as you can control these numbers, or as long as some countries obviously have freedom, which
Yeah,
seems to be working
one
well.
point about Russia, I should enter. People forget that when the Soviet Union collapsed, its population was around 300 million, and that a lot of the Russian population, which is not counted as part of Russia today, is uh, in former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan, the Central Asian republics, the Baltic states. There is a in the near abroad, a large Russian population. Alexander Dugin, the Russian uh, philosopher, propagandist, has pointed out that half the population of Ukraine is actually Russian. Of course, they're in revolt against Moscow. Actually, they want to claim they're liberating them, but it's not true. But they want this unification of the Russian populations and the former Soviet peoples, both Muslim and otherwise. This is what they're claiming. They even want to claim Finland and Alaska, which Finland hasn't been a part of the Russian Empire since World War One. The Finnish Civil War, unlike the Russian Civil War, when it went for the whites rather than the reds, and Alaska hasn't been part of the Russian Empire since the 1860s, when Secretary of State Seward arranged for America to buy Alaska. The Russians are now claiming, no, we didn't sell Alaska. We just were renting it out. So we're reclaiming it now. But there's this demographic thing of 300 million, and if you add Finland, the real population that the Moscow controls or hopes to control is very large, perhaps equal to the U.S. population. And if you add, as part of BRICS, India and China, and then the other countries, Venezuela, Brazil, Turkey, the other BRICS countries, is this forming alliance that Moscow and Beijing are trying to put together. You're looking at a huge percentage of the world's population, which they're trying to leverage in an economic war, in a perhaps open warfare, in what you call a kind of clandestine warfare. And in this demographic thing, you look at the, it's interesting. I was conversing with someone about last night about a European diplomat who has knowledge from Russian context that he knew the pandemic was coming in advance. He knew that the plan to move Africans and Arabs into Europe was part of a plan to destroy Europe. That there was a war coming to Europe, to the heart of Europe, that it wasn't just Ukraine, that the Russian forces would move beyond it. And of course, I really want to talk to this diplomat. I don't know if I'm ever going to get a chance, but what I was reported to me about what in confidence he was telling other people years ago was stunning to me. That there is knowledge out there among people in intelligence circles, diplomatic circles, that there is this sort of blueprint that Moscow and Beijing have, that they have co-opted certain Western elites, and there's domestic communist socialists here that share the same vision that would be called the socialist camp vision from the Cold War, because as any good Marxist-Leninist will tell you, during the Cold War, that the crisis of our time, the war of our time, is the battle between the socialist camp and the bourgeoisie, the world bourgeoisie, and that the socialist camp, they say, is ultimately going to triumph, and that they have these elaborate strategies, these deceptions and these wars and these economic crises that they're going to try to leverage to have the socialist camp prevail and rule the world. This is just not fully understood by a lot of people and what it is. I have this thing I wanted to read, which is from James Heiser's biography of Alexander Dugin. And he uses Eric Berglund, the German philosopher, an interpreter of the Gnostic nature of communism, Marxism, Leninism, and also the Gnostic nature of Dugin's National Bolshevism. And of course, now it's called Eurasianism. They're trying to disguise the Marxist or the Leninist content of how they're trying to colonize all kinds of ideologies, the political spectrum left to right. And there is, in Berglund talked about the idea of the third realm, and you know about the Third Reich, which is a similar concept. But Dugin has integrated this concept into Marxism, Leninism, Eurasianism, National Bolshevism. And basically this quote from Berglund quote, the first of these symbols is that of the third realm. That is the conception of a third world historical phase that is at the same time the last, the age of fulfillment. An extensive class of Gnostic ideas come under the symbol of the three phases. Now, Dugin is keen on this notion of a coming age as the third and final age. This is what Dugin wrote. He said, the metaphysics of National Bolshevism, quote, is beyond rights and beyond right and left. There's one and indivisible revolution in the dialectical triad, Third Rome, Third Reich, Third International, the Communist International. The realm of National Bolshevism, Regnum, their empire of the end. This is the perfect accomplishment of the greatest revolution of the history of the world, both continental and universal in one. It is the angel's return, the hero's resurrection, the heart's uprising against reason's dictatorship. This last revolution is a concern of the deepest spiritual kind, the headless bearer of the cross, sickle and hammer, crowned by the eternal sun symbol. Okay, I'm kind of trying to translate some of these terms on the fly, but and of course, managing the world population, creating crises, creating the pandemics, mixing Muslims with Europeans to cause a crisis. Does this resonate with you, what I've just been reading?
Well, I mean, you cannot judge these things with an ideology, because an ideology is not a handbook. It's not a gimmicky, way to understand everything and explain everything. But many people still use ideology. So, for example, Karl Marx, in his time, he claimed that socialism was very much different from this Malthusian concept, right? Because obviously the British Empire, they experimented with demographic operations and demographic planning, and there was racism involved. And so obviously the communist camp, they tried to use that what we can call white guilt card. Okay, so they were claiming that the communists were claiming we're the good guys because we handle populations differently, or you want to handle demographics differently than the capitalists, the imperialists, the colonialists, right? So Marx basically said that in capitalism, there's supposed to be a management of how big the population is, so that there's not enough halfway decent jobs, or people will fight for the better jobs, and everything is really limited. Every good position or better position is limited. But communism, he said, was different, or socialism was different. We're going to have these happy people, and there's enough work for everybody, not too much work. Everybody can share in on the spoils and the ownership and whatnot. But ultimately what we saw was this kind of this communist form of the will to destruct, or the will to destroy populations. If you're not on board with the program, you're gonna die, or you're gonna go to a labor camp, a gulag, and then you're gonna die, or we can shorten your lifespan, or we can move populations around in the Soviet realm. We just uproot you, we just take you from this spot and maybe your family, and we move you to a completely different area, so you don't have any roots anymore. And this is kind of similar to what Dugin and others have adapted from Julius Evola, on which we've done an episode recently. They called it right-wing spiritual racism. That just means if you're not on board with the program, you are marked for destruction, or you and your kids, your families, they cannot really progress. And we saw that social credit system much, much earlier in communism than most people are even aware of. This is not a fairly recent invention of the Chinese communists, but this has always been built into communism. They had what they called the black classes in China. We talked about that in an episode. When you were just poor and you didn't know where to go, you just try to go to a city and find some work or find a way to live. You were removed from the Chinese cities back to the countryside to be the poorest possible peasant, and you were labeled internally as a member of the black classes, right? And so you had to you could improve your status in a communist system, but this was a slow and arduous process. And if you behaved all your life and you took on all these sacrifices, your children had an opportunity to sort of rise up a bit higher. And if they behave, their children may be able to rise up a bit higher. So the way the Soviets or the communists, the way they handled demographics was really, really terrible. And I have a couple of notes here from various studies on how the communists used to do it. And it's now we can see how important this topic is because of the terrible demographics in Western countries, right? And the European Union, they want to bring in all these migrants, bring in all these Muslim people and people from Africa to bolster up the numbers, especially in places like Germany. And of course, now the AfD party is trying to use that opportunity. The AfD wants to present itself as the party for the German demographics. You know, they want to just improve the demographics. They want to just create this counter movement and have like this big Germany or Eurasia or whatever with lots of German kids running around, right? But if you look at a bit closer at the AfD, which has been advertised for by Elon Musk recently, the AfD membership, these people are very, very old. I think the average age of a AfD party member, the average age is like north of 60 years old at this point. And a lot of AfD support comes from the east of Germany, which has the lowest population of all of Germany. I think there's 5 times more people that live in Western Germany than live in the east. So that's something that people should be aware of, right? When you talk demographics, you have to look at what the realities are of these people claiming to save us, right? And it's like when a tiny old section of the population wants to teach everybody how to have families and how to have kids and turn the demographics around, there's a mismatch. Something really doesn't add up. And as I said before, Germany has never recovered.
Okay, let me interrupt you for a second. Let me ask you a question. Are you saying that the AfD movement, there's something false in it and in its sort of beginnings and structure? I mean, they have a lesbian leader who likes China. And then that Elon Musk is misguided in supporting it, or is he, in your opinion, trying to steal it away from Putin and the Russians? How are we to view this? Is it something we can't understand now? Is there an unconscious process going on inside the East German? You say that a lot of the people in AfD are East German and they're older. Is there an unconscious, almost alchemical spiritual process going on inside these people? Or is there a deception that's succeeding?
Well, it's like perceptions. To some people, perception is everything. I mean, this even goes back to Adolf Hitler, who would fudge any number he wanted or hide every number he wanted. People tend to not look at statistics. People not tend to look up text and look into books and whatever. They tend to go on the internet, and on the internet you will hear from the AfD and others that they will turn things around demographically, because without the demographics, you don't have a future. But as I said, a lot of the AfD support comes from a demographic minority or a geographical minority inside of Germany. So, I mean, you would basically need to see people actually having healthy families, people actually associating with other families, or having an understanding of demographics per se. If the AfD is so much pro-Russia, I mean, how terrible are the demographics in Russia? And we now can see that Russia is drawing in. Russia is drawing in a lot more Muslims as migrants. They incorporate North Koreans into the Russian military to send to Ukraine. There's talk about Russia maybe having to give up territory for the Chinese because they have so many people. So it's like you need to understand the demographics, and you can't just perform this political ideological mind magic of saying things are a certain way even though they're not. And I think that magical mumbo jumbo that we see from the right wing and the Eurasians, I think that make believe is different, much different than what we see from Elon Musk, because I think Elon is very forward thinking. He's thinking decades ahead, and he has certain ideas what the future needs to be. And then it takes time and steps to actually go there. So I think that Elon is
He does
thinking
talk
into.
about, yeah, he does talk about population and how people need to have children. And this is a very important thing because we need to have children. We need to love children. We need to have women being mothers again. Not this feminism, not this Leninized form of feminism. I mean, real feminism is I'm a woman, I want to have a child. My fulfillment is in being a mother. That's real feminism. Not saying I just want to be another kind of man, right?
Yeah,
And I want to break the glass ceiling and be a corporate executive or whatever. I mean, what's more important, being a mom or being a corporate executive? There's no future in corporate executive women. There's a future in women being moms and loving their kids and taking care of their families. I mean, is that supposed to be a kind of slavery?
yeah,
According to Gloria Steinem and all these, secret communists who pushed the what was it, the comfortable concentration camp of the home.
yeah,
This nonsense came out of Soviet Russia, the emancipation of women in the Marx Engels style. Engels on the family. If anybody wants to read about it, yeah, it came out of Marxism. It was written about in the 19th century. The home was going to be led by a mom who was a single mom, and the men were like naked nomads who
yeah,
had no place. Male authority destroyed. This is what's destroyed. To destroy the relationship between men and women, to destroy, they're against patriarchy. Well, guess what? Read Max Weber. Every single stable structure of the West, of the building of civilization, of the making of positive life, has been based on
yeah.
patriarchy.
And we
There was
Germans,
no positive matriarchal society. Sorry, people.
yeah, and we Germans, I mean, especially we Germans, we kind of had to relearn how to have families and how to be a family, because
Well, you
it's,
lost so many men in the war.
yeah, not
You had
just
all these
that,
women without men after the war because so many
yeah.
Germans died in the war. So many German men.
Yeah, and not just that, but also when World War II ended, you saw demographic operations being launched against Western Germany by communist East Germany, and by extension the Soviet Union. They were trying to run demographic operations. So, for example, if you have, let's say, you have a 30-year-old in Germany today, right? And this person would tell his parents, well, you were not good parents, and but these parents would then say, you have no idea how terrible my parents were, and their parents would say, you have no idea how crazy my parents were. So it goes back generations. When you get into the First World War or pre-First World War, or you get down to the third, it gets down in history, down the path of war after war, chaos after chaos. And so, I mean, I listen to the stories of my grandparents and what they had to say, and sometimes they would tell you a lot by not wanting to talk about their parents at all, trying to completely forget their own family experience. So we have all this trouble. We had to relearn after World War II how to be families. But then came these Soviet demographic unbalancing or destabilizing operations, when kids were encouraged to literally hate their parents just for being still conservative, after World War II, or they would attack their
Yeah, that
parents
was the
because
1960s thing,
yeah,
wasn't it? I mean,
yeah,
that was a lot of the 60s radicalization of the youth. And it wasn't only in Germany, it was in the US
yeah.
and it was in France and other Western countries.
And we made we Germans, we made an art form after 1945. We literally turned mindless bliss into an art form. So if you watch television or movies from that period, if you learn about the lifestyle of the 50s and the 60s and the economic miracle, we perfected mindless or seemingly mindless bliss, because that was the only thing that people really knew how to do at that point. Because you were focused on making money, raising children, not really knowing how. And so this was seized upon by communist operations. And so you were supposed to hate your parents because your father was a regular soldier in the war, or your parents were, they lived during the Nazi era, and they were
And
not
there was
interested.
this notion that the Frankfurt School brought up of the authoritarian personality,
Yeah, and of course
where they
the
attacked any conservative values at all.
and there's always a disconnect between the older generation and the next generation. And so the Soviets had all these scientists, the psychologists and the anthropologists, and they were stealing all the data and science from the West. So they kind of knew how the Germans kind of really function. And so the younger generation in the 60s especially and onwards, the younger generation would condemn the older German generation for being in that mindless bliss state, only caring about the next car or improving the house, or getting the next pay rise at their job, and just manicuring the garden, and just have that in your spare time. But when the younger generation, when they started to grow up, they became slightly more conservative, because that's just how the world is. But then this newer generation also had children, and then this whole cycle started again. So children blaming their parents for being, not good parents, even though there was no crash course parent school, there was no handbook for us Germans to raise children, really. And
Isn't it true that, in a way, communism has waged a demographic war on the West to try to kill the family, to kill the birth rate? There would be no future soldiers to cause all these problems. China had its one child policy because China was so grossly overpopulated. And now they're in a crisis, a demographic crisis, maybe worse than anybody's. But in a way, Marxism as a form of nihilism, as a form of maybe unconscious destructionism. You look at Marx, you look at the psychopathy, the radical narcissism in Marx, in Lenin, the madness in Lenin. I mean, Lenin is a psychopath. I mean, you look at the documents that they're hiding in in Moscow, in the archive of Lenin's, kill the whole village, murder all the women and children, using the F word. Just there's like 6,000 of these documents that are being hidden. Um, the lie is propagated again and again that socialism is something beneficial, that it's
yeah,
true humanitarianism, it's true democracy, it's true freedom. But what it is it's almost like a cult of death, for the elimination of mankind, for the destruction of the core relationship between man and woman. It is we have to understand this as an attack
yeah.
on the most
And
fundamental aspects of human existence.
a lot of the Russian stuff, or pro Russian stuff that's out there on the internet, it's covering different topics and whatever. But a lot of what these pro Russian guys are putting out, the influencers, AFD people, a lot of it is sort of distorted, hyper masculine. It's kind of like this it reminds me of some of the Nazi propaganda. It's like this exaggerated, distorted, pseudo hyper masculine stuff. So when you have that strategy, when you have people like Dugin, and when you have all this warfare going on in Ukraine and this brutality, it attracts a certain segment of men. And if these influencers online, even in the United States, when they look at their numbers on social media, oftentimes, especially on YouTube and other platforms, you can see how many of your people in your audience are male or female. And I guess that with most of these influencers, their audience is almost entirely male. So if you feed a male audience this exaggerated, hyper crazy stuff, it makes women, it turns women off. It turns women away from these men, which is the opposite of what the AfD and others are claiming. They're claiming we're creating families, we want to turn the demographics around, but by brainwashing men in that specific way, that's just going to turn women away. And at the same time, the Russians, they still try to influence the women here. They still try to influence the men here who are not crazy, hyper, brutal, masculine. Then they try to use esoterics. They try to use all kinds of stuff. But still, it's not. There's a disconnect. If you're pro-Russian, if you're a pro-Russian sort of esoteric soft man, or a soft person, soft woman, you still can't really connect with these men, these brainwashed pro-Russian men. It just doesn't jive. It just doesn't work together. So, and this is how you can get these numbers. When East Germans, they're the most biggest supporters of the AfD, but nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to live in the East. Very few people live there. AfD members are very old, and a lot of these supporters are also very, very old. And the younger men, if they get more frustrated because they can't attract the women they want, or they can't get women to have a family with them, that makes these young men angry. So this is what the Russians want to use. So direct that anger at whatever target. Usually it's America. Americans are guilty of everything.
And it's very funny, Alex. I noticed that that in Europe, I was shocked. When I studied the immigrant crisis, especially 10 years ago, when there were more than 1 million Muslims and Africans pouring into Europe, and the Russian mafia and the Russian services and the Turks were facilitating this movement of people into Europe, into the heart of Europe, into Germany, especially. And I was surprised they were blaming America for this. They were blaming American wokeism when it's really the EU. It's really the left. It's really the communist-influenced left of old that had always been pushing this, because behind the feminism, which broke up the family and lowered the birth rate, the economic centers of Europe and America said, we don't have enough people to keep the economic growth going. Where are we going to get the people to do the jobs? We need immigrants from Africa in the Middle East, in Europe. We need immigrants from Mexico and Latin America and Asia in the United States. So suddenly you had created this dynamic. I have to think that Russian think tanks decades ago thought this through and realized, if we can pump Europe full of non-European people, non-Christian people, we can create this split in Europe. The joke is it's Eurabia. Europe is being turned into a Muslim thing, and this split can then become a crisis. And of course, if they encourage the young women, oh, you don't want a white husband, you want an African, brown is appealing, you have to prove you're not a racist. And so suddenly you have this thing happening where then there's another reason for European men to feel alienated. And of course, Marxism, I think, consciously preys on the alienated. And I go to Eric Voegelin's reflections, where he talks about the origins of totalitarianism in the alienated personality. This alienated personality is angry, as you say, is alienated. And then what is the false solution? The thing that suddenly appeals to them spiritually? It's the totalitarian solution, right?
Yeah. It's that, yeah, when the state becomes your family, and the ideological community, they're your brothers, and this is kind of your family. Now when you're in Germany, because for a long time, Muslim migration was people from Turkey, right? So they came here as these guest workers, and became more and more, and then they stayed, and they had families, and then they got people from Turkey coming over, intermarrying with them. So this was for a long time, this was Muslim migration here. And if you see Turkish derived Germans here, when there's a wedding, just a wedding, right? They will have 300 guests, 600 guests. They will throw the biggest party you have ever seen in your life, because they have this hyper focus on family, and they treat families in a different way. Now, I'm not saying they're doing it the right way, but this is a strong contrast between these people with a Turkish background and just the regular Germans, because as Germans, we have all these bonding issues. We have like this. We don't know how families function really, because the German history was so terrible, and it's like when you don't have a real family, or you have a dysfunctional family, you still get your ideological brothers, so to say, right? But still, when anything the communists touch, even when it's their very own operations, and we talked about this with the Willy Münzenberg story, this propagandist in Germany who was supposed to create the conditions for a communist full takeover of Germany in 1923. When you read into the story of somebody like Willy Münzenberg, there was so much mistrust and backstabbing inside the communist movement, which was encouraged, right? When suddenly the new orders came down from Moscow, and Willy Münzenberg was thinking, should we do this another way? Should we really let the fascists do their thing? I don't understand these
Mm-hmm.
orders. I
Right.
don't like these orders. I'm gonna just subvert these orders. I'm just gonna do my own thing. And they
When
hunted
that
him
got him
down.
killed,
The
yeah,
communists
they
basically
hunted him
hunted him
down.
down.
Yeah.
They hunted him down, and he was falling from grace so fast, and he kept writing these communist officials and saying, I was an early adopter. I was there when the Lenin and the others were in Switzerland, and nobody
Yes.
really thought they could pull it off in Russia. I was there at the very first moment. I'm an old schooler, and there were so many of them. We're the old schoolers. We were there with the revolution, but they all got killed. There was a strong sense of distrust. Nobody was really supposed to trust
Well,
anybody
well,
else.
here's the deep reason for it, and it's really found, I think, in Kotkin's biography of Stalin, because Kotkin said that the profundity of Kotkin's first volume, for which I think history will be grateful to him for that, is the insight, which was so profound in his first volume, that that nobody could have made communism work in a country except for Stalin. He was a unique genius. Now, how did he make it work? Why would have Trotsky or Kamenev or Zinoviev or Radek or any of the others? Why would they have failed to make communism work? The reason was simple. Stalin had the dialectical insight that for communism to be effective and more destructive, it had to actually develop a kind of relationship with, a red-brown thing, a relationship with the ultra-right, a relationship with conservatism, so that he created the Soviet family by bringing in concepts from the Orthodox Christian family. He went against abortion. By 1934, abortion was largely illegal in the Soviet Union. It wasn't until Khrushchev and the gang, who he called blind kittens, brought abortion back, which was they really didn't understand Stalin's method, although they moved back towards it unconsciously by adopting their long range strategy with Sokolovsky and KGB General Mironov in the late 50s. The whole complexity of Stalin's machine was that Stalin was this living, walking contradiction who could actually bring a Hitler to power in Europe, could work with fascists, could have a sometimes friendly relationship with Mussolini's Italy, strangely enough, could, and this is my theory, could have a clandestine communication with Hitler at the end of the war saying, why did you put all the panzer divisions against the Americans? I can hold back on you a while. Why don't you create a sort of why don't you escape to Latin America, to South America, to create a Nazi diaspora, and it'll be full of my agents and we can work together to destroy the West. This kind of thing was going on within Nazism, and because they both shared the same hatred of the Western order, they all represented this chaotic communication, and this chaos that World War II represented, the chaos of violence, is there's this Dugin wrote this. He talked about unleashing chaos. He called himself a prophet of chaos, and at the end of the fourth political theory, he wrote this. This is so weird. Dugin, the Putin's brain. He wrote, chaos can think. We should ask her how she does this. We have asked Logos. Now it is the turn of chaos. We must learn to think with chaos within the chaos. Think about how nihilistic this is. To make an appeal to chaos is the only way to save Logos. I mean, think about how twisted this is. This is like a satanic, a black formula. Logos needs a savior. It cannot save itself. Now, this is an inversion of uniting with God, of seeking God. This is like seeking the darkness, right? Chaos. In conclusion, it is not correct to conceive chaos as something belonging to the past. Chaos is eternal, but eternally coexisting with time. Therefore, chaos is always absolutely new, fresh, and spontaneous. But of course, chaos represents the destruction, the wiping away of the existing order that of course Karl Marx and the revolution wanted, thinking that if we just eliminate everything, something new will just suddenly automatically grow in its place. And this is what the great error that Berglund pointed out. This Gnosticism, this destructionism, there is nothing new that grows in it. It's just destruction and murder for its own sake.
When you have children, you make different decisions, or your decision-making process is different because you value that stability, because you recognize how great it is and how important it is. You value that stability, so you have a different decision-making process. If you don't have a family, or you have a very dysfunctional family, or only dysfunctional experiences, as many Germans have, your decision-making process is different. And exactly as you just mentioned, you're starting to love chaos, and you're starting to love destruction, and let's just set everything on fire and see what comes after, right? This is sort of what the Russians are using. And if you look at Karl Marx, I mean, he was far more German than, in a negative sense, than people actually give him credit for, because he just had that very specific German brand of completely dysfunctional, rotten view on a family. Because if you look at what he wrote to his mother, if you look at how he was a leech, just exploiting his own father and keeping, he kept disappointing his father, and he was always ripping off his relatives for money, not paying them back, and threatening to set up loans in their name and then disappearing, and just extorting his own family. And also when
Marx, when Marx's father Heinrich Marx died, he was mainly only interested in the money. He treated his mother rather brutally.
Yeah, and we have that in his own writing, because Marx kept writing Friedrich Engels, and we now have a more complete, or almost a complete set of these letters. The Soviets had a complete record, I think, but they would murder their own people, who had access to them. And now we have a fairly full set of these letters. And in these letters, Karl Marx is talking in a normal uh, way. It's not like his ramblings and his manipulative word magic. He's talking like an actual person. It's completely different. And he says things like, well, I hope this old dog, one family member, I hope this old dog dies, finally bites the dust so I can get his money. And he was always in money trouble because he couldn't handle people, he couldn't handle money. Obviously, people believed he was the teacher of all things money
He was a
and people.
spendthrift. He would even buy
Yeah,
weapons for the revolution and all kinds of
yeah,
things.
yeah,
And
yeah. And so when
he's crazy.
he would drag his wife from a noble family and his kids. He would drag them around. Eventually, they ended up in Britain, and they were still his kids were getting ill, and his kids started dying, and his wife was going nuts. This is how he handled family matters. This is who he was, and I mean, he seems more like a cliche. Uh, he seems more like a cliche little home dictator, just like Stalin. Stalin gave the impression of a mob leader, a mob gangster. And same with Putin. Same with Putin today. He seems more like the mob leader, and he's never demonstrated an ability to maintain a family. Now apparently Putin hates his first wife, and I don't think his first wife really liked him. There were some spy operations, actually. I think one of the rare successes of West German spying, original spying, not just using American resources. They actually kind of sort of infiltrated. I mean, German intelligence. They actually kind of sort of infiltrated the circle around Putin when he was still with the KGB in East Germany, in Dresden, and they heard some things, as apparently Putin's original wife was complaining to a female friend.
Ludmila
Yeah,
Putina,
yeah.
right?
She was complaining
Yeah.
to a female friend about how she was treated by Vladimir, and that he was a violent guy, and he was just a terrible human being. And of course later on, we the actual children, or the later children of Vladimir Putin, are kept absolutely secret, and there's rumblings in the media that some of his children, they live abroad, they don't like him, and
You
Putin
mean his
kept.
daughters? His
Yeah,
daughters
yeah,
with Ludmila?
yeah. Some of his kids
Interesting.
don't really want to be associated with him, and it's like when there's media coverage insinuating that Putin is having relationships with famous ice skaters, and he's associating
Hmm.
with women, but we never really know. It's not like in the United States where every detail is scrutinized with Trump's family, and the Obamas are marketing themselves, and you could get updates almost daily on the family and such. It's a complete secret in Russia. Why? It's
Well,
not
it's
just for.
interesting what you say. Yeah, it's very funny, but you say that about Putin's children. Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, uh, as soon as she could, she got away and immigrated to the United States.
Yeah, and
She got
Stalin
out of
probably.
there.
Yeah, Stalin probably shot one of his wives. I mean, they still say she
Yes,
shot
Svetlana's
herself, but
mother. Yeah,
yeah, she shot herself
yeah.
with a revolver. But he was drunk. I mean, at that night, Stalin was super drunk and super angry, and we know how he
Yeah,
was when he.
she supposedly shot herself with his revolver
Yeah,
because
and
Stalin always walked around with a revolver in his pocket, and this is the same thing. Hitler had also a Walther PKW, or what, I'm probably mangling the name. Hitler had one, and it's really weird parallel between the two dictators that both of them had loves. It was Hitler's
oh
niece,
yeah, there
Hitler's
was a similar
half
incident.
sister's
There was
daughter.
a
Yeah, where supposedly she shot herself with his pistol,
Hitler's
just the
pistol.
same
Yeah,
way. Yeah, the Hitler's pistol, just the same way Stalin's wife shot herself with the pistol. And both men's fathers started out as cobblers, and it's weird, and were beaten by their fathers. I mean, there's these weird parallels between
Mm.
the biography of Hitler and the biography of Stalin.
Yeah, and obviously
You know,
when you were rising up in the Nazi system, and there's so many examples of that, you can read the autobiographies, you can read historical works about them. I mean, you can see a certain trend there. For example, when you read up on Rommel, for example. Now, Rommel was so busy and he was kept busy for such a long time. Rommel was effectively communicating with his, especially with his son, through a bunch of letters. That was all that most of what the relationship was between Rommel and his son, and there was no
because he
time.
was always away fighting. You know,
Yeah, and it's not just the famous guys. I mean, there was so many of them. I think
yeah.
Albert Speer and so many others, and Martin Bormann.
Many of the German
It's like, yeah,
generals,
it's
the
like
younger
they
generals.
they they really were not family people. Some were on paper, but even the average somewhat higher ranking Nazi official and military officer, they had a hard time actually maintaining a family life. And we know that
Yeah.
from the
Well, Rommel, we
regulations.
know famously his letters to his wife were published, and a lot of his biographical notes were published into almost his account on the fly of the Africa campaign. It's quite wonderful to read. He makes some errors of memory, but it is Rommel was quite an author. Sort of like not intending to be, but in his letters and his notes to himself. Um, there's a rich archive also in many of the generals talking about the war later. But yes, it is to have a generation of German men, manhood, separated from their families because they're fighting this extensive war
Yeah.
that's going on for almost 6 years, and so many of them dying, not coming back. Um, this
I mean, in
is this
essence,
has really been a crippling
yeah.
experience for the
And in
German
essence,
nation.
in some ways, actually many ways, Adolf Hitler turned into a version of his own father, whom he absolutely hated and possibly even poisoned because, that whole backstory.
Yeah,
But
you went into this before. Yeah,
Yeah,
quite fascinating.
and so we I mean we can say for certain that Adolf Hitler hated his father, absolutely massively hated his father. And so but when Hitler became powerful, especially in the 30s, before the war started, Hitler was sort of turning into a version of his father. He was trying to run the show. Very violent guy. He would treat many other people like his children. So he would sit at the table. He was supposed to be the master of the table. He would dictate the conversation like his own father probably did. He would make these choices and then present everybody with this determined choice, and everybody had to accept it. And he had his favorites, like probably Adolf's father had his favorites, and in these family members, eventually they kind of know how to manipulate the crazy violent father. They gauge his momentary state of mind. They know what state of mind he's in, and so they adapt their own behavior according to that situation. And this is what happened a lot with Adolf Hitler later on. So everybody tried to gauge what state of mind he was in, and they tried to manage his emotions. So he turned into his own dysfunctional father, for certain. And people, of course, they expected him to get his princess. In public, everybody expected.
This is the result of not being connected to your true self, of having a false self. This is the narcissism of Hitler in the false personality of the Führer, this supposed savior of the German people, which is ironic because the Thousand-Year Reich and the savior of the German people. This is borrowed from Christianity and Judaism, which he hated. It's ironic that he would then reflect, would then reflect in a kind of pagan mystical way the exact structures of Christian apocalyptic and millenarian thought in his own construction of the ideology of the Third Reich. Even the term Third Reich, as I noted before, the Third Realm, the Third Rome that is supposedly Moscow. All it's almost as if, and the reason why talking about Hitler and Lenin and Marx and Putin all in the same uh, discourse is because there's this connection with this third realm, Third Reich, Third Rome, Dugin's Eurasianism. There is a transfer of the German Third Reich psychopathology to Moscow. To the communism, both in China and Russia, has slowly migrated towards National Socialism, to a kind of red brown, kind of
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it, a kind of ghost inside the vast bureaucratic machine that is congealing spiritually within all this, or demonically, perhaps.
Well, the actual, well, hypothetical, of course, hypothetical communism was something that was deliberately placed into the future. So the communist movement, they could always say, we have to do all this stuff we're doing because in the future there will be this wonderland.
And
And
it
with the
was an
Nazis,
unreachable future.
and with the
Yeah,
not yeah with
we would never reach it.
yeah
Yes.
and with the Nazis, it was all about this envy of the bourgeoisie, or the average conservative family out there, because Hitler didn't like the conservatives because they were not revolutionary enough, they were not crazy enough, they were not angry enough. Because real conservatives, they had children, they liked stability, they liked moving forward in a cautious way. And Hitler was he disliked it. He disliked conservatives, and he was envious of conservatives. He created his own weird party family with his supposed brothers, and with the Eurasian movement, they also put that utopia into the future and say, well, now we all have to be really angry and do crazy things, set a lot of things on fire, and then at some point in the future, whoever's left, then they will enjoy what they were seeking in the first place. And I have some notes here on what the reality ultimately was, for people under Russian control. So from 1930 to 1952, the government of the Soviet Union, on the orders of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and under the direction of the NKVD official Lavrentiy Beria, forcibly transferred populations of various groups. So they removed anti-Soviet categories of populations, deportations of entire nationalities, labor force transfer, and organized migrations in opposite directions to fill ethnically cleansed territories. So so there was people had been moved around that were Poles, Norwegians, Romanians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Volga Germans, Ingrian Finns, Crimean Tatars, Crimean Greeks, and it just goes on and on and on. Shortly before, during, and immediately after World War II, Stalin conducted a series of deportations on a huge scale, which profoundly affected the ethnic map of the Soviet Union. It's estimated that between 1941 and 1949, nearly 3.3 million people were deported to Siberia and the Central Asian republics. By some estimates, up to 43% of the resettled population died of diseases and malnutrition. And of course, you never do just an operation. You always attach an information operation to it. You try to control the narrative. So there was a study, it's called The Failure of Demographic Statistics, a Soviet Response to Population Troubles. Well, if you have a problem, you just deny it. You just say it's not there. So at
Yeah, in
these
fact, I think it was 1937 or 38 that Stalin just shot the entire Census Bureau, just had them lined up and shot. And he didn't, my understanding, if I'm remembering Robert Conquest's Stalin biography correctly, no explanation was given for shooting them. But the people that replaced them understood that they had come. I think it was 12 or 13 million. They they gave the correct population of the Soviet Union, which meant that 13 million people had died, the Ukraine famine, the Volga famine, the mass killings of the Bolshevik regime, and the losses in the Gulag. Stalin didn't want that loss of human beings to show up in the census. So they just corrected it and said, well, they were covering up the mass murder and saying, oh, the population of the Soviet Union is higher
Yeah.
than this previous. And then he didn't shoot them. They had understood.
Yeah, yeah, it's like it's basically Orwell's 1984 when they continuously change the numbers, and you can never say last week's
And
numbers.
this relates to China. We don't, this rumor that China's real population is 800 million, that it's 400 or 500 million less than they have claimed, it being 1.3 million or 1.2 million or 1.4. I think some people claim.
Yeah,
They
billions.
don't want you to know the real numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the how these people are, how old are they, how sick are they, can they really care for them? So at the 17th Congress of the Communist Party, Stalin claimed that the Soviet population had increased to 168 million by the end of 1933. This was in Pravda. According to the memories of Mikhail Kurman, who was then working for the Soviet Central Statistical Administration, Stalin, on his own initiative, exaggerated the actual statistical estimate by about 8 million. He's just creating 8 million people out of thin air in his mind. In a subsequent conversation concerning this population figure, the head of the Central Statistical Administration was told by the dictator that he himself knew which figure to give. However, according to Kurman, Stalin's original figure was lowered by 1 million in the publication of the party Congress documents. So, according to recent estimates, the human losses of the period of forced collectivization and the 1932-1933 famine were about 7 million people. In 1935, Stalin again used demography in his propaganda and falsely claimed a natural increase of about 3 million in the Soviet Union as proof of Soviet prosperity. This allegedly rapid increase of Soviet population was often featured in the Soviet propaganda of the 1930s. So he was supposed to celebrate a fact that is not a fact at all. This is completely made up. I mean, how could you verify this anyway? I mean, if you thought, well, I don't really believe that, according to what I'm seeing, this is not reality, you couldn't check this out, and you certainly could not talk about it. Now, in today's Russia, we have more information from not just official places, but also other places, information that leaks to the West. So there's so much stuff you can deduct things from. For example, when COVID hit, you could tell how many funerals there were, how many this, how many that. When the official war casualty numbers were put out, people could figure out how many families were applying for government help because one of their family members has died, right? So there's so many applications for disabled soldiers now. They need physical therapy, they need operations, they need psychological help. So we can always tell that even today in Russia, some numbers are really secret, some numbers they give out are completely false, but we can still kind of track what reality is. But even when you have all the information in Russia, even when you magically have the truth, right? You're not allowed to communicate it, right? You cannot really talk to other people and interpret this information and say the government is bad, we need a change in government, we need this, we need that, and the other. The moment you do that, you get into trouble, and so there's just it's a pre-Stalin era in which we're now in Russia. It's not quite there yet. It's not quite full Stalin yet, but we're getting there. And it's like they have massive demographic problems now in Russia, and now they started to use North Koreans in the Ukraine war. And there's stuff all the time that you can see on the web where they would falsify the identities of these Korean soldiers. They give them false papers, and when they're captured, you can find out they're Korean. They're not Russian at all. And so this is kind of
Yeah.
the secrecy and the trickery that's been going on in Russia for such a long time.
Yeah.
And
And it shows that this is a coalition war. War. It isn't just Russia itself is a. People think Russia is a kind of a normal country, but it's a country full of non-Russians. A lot of
Yeah.
non-Russians in Russia. A lot of minorities. It's really an old empire that had conquered many people who are not Russian,
Yeah,
and
even
use and the communist colonization, the colonization by Stalin of North Korea, the colonization by Stalin of China, the colonization of Southeast Asia, the colonization of Eastern Europe. We see these old elites, these old structures created by the communists, rallying to Russia. Whether
yeah.
it's Orban's Hungary, Georgescu in Romania trying to become president, the very sly and slippery Donald Tusk in Poland, Scholz in Germany. It's that there is a kind of residual socialist camp. Well, it's a socialist camp. It's by any other name of the Cold War. And it's still being fought. The Cold War never stopped. And we in the West had this illusion that they encouraged in China and Russia. We're going to fool the West. We're going to have a great peace offensive. We're going to have the Soviet Union disappear, and then the West will neglect its nuclear arsenal. We'll build up ours, and then if we have to, we'll just nuke them flat.
Yeah.
Nuke the Americans and just take possession of Asia and Europe.
Russia has changed so much over the centuries. I mean, when you have these political cleansing operations, when you just identify millions of people and you send them to the gulag or you just kill them outright, you not just change demographic numbers here. You're not just removing a million here and a million there and 7 million people
you have a
from Ukraine.
spiritual shock. You have a
Yeah.
psychological wounding and damaging of the psyche.
And it's also the question of what are the characteristics of the people you have just killed removed from circulation. It's not just a number.
Oh
It's
yes,
not just
You're
okay.
also they're destroying the quality people,
Yeah,
the
it's like
people who want the truth,
yeah,
the deepest people. You're killing them off.
yeah. And I
Yes.
think there's a serious lack of research when it comes to the psychometric way of choosing whom to kill, because for a long time in the Soviet system they had a lot of choice whom to target, right? So some person may do something the government doesn't like, another person does something, but they have the choice: do we kill that guy or do we kill that guy over there? And then they would maybe look at other factors and then make a specific choice. Now, when for quite a while communism in its earlier stages, communism could have been destroyed in Russia by Russians themselves. But the communists were equipped with this psychological knowledge and anthropological knowledge, how people are. And you mentioned earlier in the show
Although I want to interject, it's a false anthropological knowledge when compared to the anthropology of Christianity,
yeah,
because it's the true redemptive aspect is falsified by the revolution, by political redemption, which is a contradiction in terms. There's no political
yeah.
redemption. There's
So
no from our trouble. What does the song say from Sting? There is no solution to our troubled evolution. There is no political
yeah,
solution. Whatever.
there was
There isn't any.
there was a specific set of characteristics of these people in Russia and Soviet Union in general who defied communism, who tried to defy communism. I mean, there's specific characteristics. It's a mix of initiative. How much initiative are you willing to take? Do you want to initiate things by yourself, or you just want to wait for other people to tell you what to do? There's all these characteristics of these people that were removed, and then of course with the Soviet demographics, people started to wonder over there, why don't we have initiative? Why don't we have trailblazer people who invent something new and just show initiative, right? This is something that the United States had in abundance, initiative. One of the biggest characteristics I think of Americans is problem solving, it's initiative. And this was severely lacking in Russia, not just because it was deemed illegal, but also because they physically removed people who had specific characteristics. Now, if everybody was hyper focused in a population on initiative, it would also create problems. Not everybody is supposed to be one way, but if you remove specific characteristics from your population, it's hard to get them back if you can do that at all. And so I think there's a severe lack of research when it comes to really choosing and selecting the victims. Now, when the orders trickled down in Soviet Russia and Soviet China, the quotas, you have to kill 3 people out of 1,000 or whatever it was, and then they doubled that in a practical sense. But it was, the orders were trickled down. You have to find specific people, but I think at the top they knew from the psychological experts that they had, they knew how to give the right orders to hit the appropriate persons and to target people who showed initiative, target people who were brave enough to stand up for themselves and others, and people who would show initiative when it comes to protecting your own family, people who would operate on the black market, people who would have side hustles, people who would be creative in feeding their families, right? So they would target those guys. But if you were a scumbag, the system could work with a scumbag, right? The system could work with somebody who would exploit others, but if there
The
was
psychopath will be elevated to a higher level
yeah,
because he's
yeah,
recognized by the other psychopaths as a fellow psychopath.
yeah. And so it's like they changed the genetic makeup of Russia over the course of the communist era and the post-communist era. I mean, it's like
And by the way, it may not be genetic; it may be a spiritual conditioning to
oh yeah.
psychopathy.
Yeah, and also if you,
Yeah,
they don't. I mean, in today's world, let's say in the Putin era, which has gone on for a very long time, in the Putin era, they don't so much have to kill you outright, but if they throw you down on the social hierarchy ladder, you get into legal trouble, this, that, and the other. You're blacklisted from the more comfortable realms of society. What does the person end up with? Alcoholism, bad medical treatment, and 10 other things. So that person will not have a large life expectancy. That person will not have a happy, stable family and teach his kids to make up their own mind.
you're turning people into borderlines. You're
Yeah,
making borderline personality disorder universal among your
you're
population.
killing them slowly, or you're basically creating circumstances where they kill themselves slowly through
They have to
vodka.
self-medicate with alcohol, like many of the
Yeah,
men in Russia do.
vodka,
Yeah,
and prostitution. As I mentioned, there's a huge AIDS epidemic in Russia.
and a
There's
huge opium
yeah,
epidemic. Russia may have the
yeah,
worst opiate problem. And after all, they're the core of opium trafficking throughout the world. They've been promoting it, as Joe Douglas showed in his book. This has been a Russian project since 1960 to pump opium,
yeah,
heroin into the world.
yeah. And it's like here's another study. I think it's from the Aspen Institute. It says in the late 1980s, near the end of the communist era, there were just a handful of European countries, most of them under communist rule, with higher fertility rates than Russia's. By 2005, the last year for which authoritative data is available, or was at the time, there were only a few European societies, perhaps ironically, most of them ex-communist, with lower rates. So for a long time, the Soviets, well, they would fudge their numbers. At some point, they could actually present numbers and say, we're we have this society that's functioning. People have babies, but this was all based in communism on Western technology, which was stolen or bought through various channels. And it was also a system that was essentially run on debt. It was a system that was run on selling things or robbing Peter to pay Paul within the Soviet system. It was all very unstable. So when the jig was up, at least officially, the communist economic system was no longer there, then you could see the actual reality of how much the Russian state could afford or wanted to afford to invest in its own people. It says, it's so much poor health conditions. A consortium headed by the World Health Organization estimated that for 2005, a woman's risk of death in childbirth in Russia was over 6 times higher than in Germany or Switzerland. Moreover, mortality levels for women in their 20s, the decade in which childbearing is concentrated in contemporary Russia, have been rising, not falling in recent decades. And it goes on. In 1980, fewer than one Russian newborn in 9 was reportedly born out of wedlock. By 2005, the country's illegitimacy ratio was approaching 30%, almost a tripling in just 20 years. Marriage is not only less common in Russia today than in the recent past, it is also markedly less stable. In 2005, the total number of marriages celebrated in Russia was down by nearly 1/4 from 1980. On the other hand, the total number of divorces recognized in Russia has been on an erratic rise over the past generation, from under 400 divorces per 1,000 marriages in 1980 to a peak of over 800 in 2002.
800 divorces per 1,000 marriages? Really?
Yeah.
Is that right? Oh
that's
my
what
gosh,
the
that's so
study says.
appalling. But it shows you how dysfunctional the male-female relationship in Russia is. I've read this too. I've been told this by Russians that however bad the divorce and family courts are in the West, which is basically taken from the Marxist feminist agenda, but that in Russia it's even worse. Russia is ahead of the curve. It's like the Dark Knight and Batman, the Joker. I'm not evil. I'm just ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Russia is ahead of the curve. They really are.
Well, let me just double check that figure here. The divorce rates. In Russia.
The abortion rate in the latter years of the Soviet Union, the average Russian woman had 7 abortions.
I copied those numbers from a PDF document study, and there was footnotes attached to it. So it's more like
right.
It's a lower number per 1,000 people, but there's still this dramatic increase. So you see numbers double, and then
it sounds like a doubling.
Yeah,
it sounds like a doubling.
And so, and then there's this. In 1996, the picture was already radically different. Barely a third of Russia's women were getting married and staying in that same marriage until age 50. So there are marriages, but they don't last. Yeah. They don't last, and the families that exist are not real families. They're just very, very dysfunctional. Nobody's.
They
really
have the
happy.
Same kind of support, by the way, for unmarried women in Russia as they do in many Western countries.
Yeah.
Here we are. We're almost out of time, Alex. We've been going for a couple hours now. Your last thoughts? Go ahead.
Well, it's like people need to understand that reality is not necessarily what you want it to be, and once you get a grip on reality, you can actually start making changes to reality, and it's like when sometimes people outright believe the Russian propaganda and they say, yeah, that's totally true. And sometimes there's this doublethink going on, like in George Orwell's 1984, when they have these contradicting thoughts, but they accept both of them at the same time. So sometimes people will almost brainwash themselves, and they will think that, or subconsciously even think that, by pushing a lie, it will advance your cause, and then eventually it will make it true. But that's kind of this new right-wing Eurasianist form of magic or chaos magic or word magic, when you just you say these words like they have magic powers, and you associate with these forces like the Russians, in the hopes of actually making it true at some point. And then there's, of course, the outright psychos, and they just think that, well, once we have power, maybe directly, maybe just by proxy with Russia running us, maybe if so the psychos think maybe if they get a certain amount of power, they can just take what they want. They can just grab young girls or be assigned a young girl and then be happy with that. There's also that, and so this it's like some people are very timid. They don't really know what to think. They don't really know what to do in a political sense. And there's just a very large passive majority, because these people also have been conditioned by various political movements and whatnot to be that passive. So being passive can be really, really dangerous, but also sometimes being more active can really destroy things and harm your own interests.
Well, thank you, Alex. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the United States. My co-host has been Alex Benesch in Germany. We've had this discussion of some of the deeper meanings behind totalitarianism, National Socialism, communism, and Eurasianism, what's happening today. And so I want to thank you for joining us. I hope you'll join us next week for another discussion. This has been Friends and Enemies, and until next time.